Hi, everyone. So I'm going to try to introduce myself as I do this. So I am actually a professor of film and new media studies. So my projects were the project that I'm going to describe is a little bit different. But I usually teach film and television are kind of my areas that I teach in. But in my intro to film studies class, we do a day on transmedia franchises, which I'll define in a few minutes. But I started to get really interested in them when I realized how many of my students were watching superhero movies and how much they loved them and how much I love them. And so I've decided to expand my transmedia franchises day into a whole course for spring 2020. So I'm going to do a whole course on transmedia franchising. And so I'll describe a little bit about what I did in the Intro to Film Studies class, but actually I'm going to propose one unit that I'm thinking about and a final assignment for that class, and I'm kind of actually hoping to get feedback on it from other digitally inclined folks. So that's kind of my purpose for being here today. I also, started to think about superhero movies because of how important they were at the box office. So this is from 2018, that superhero movies accounted for 25% of the domestic box office in 2018. 6 out of 10 of the top grossing movies featured superheroes. Most of those are Disney, so Disney owns both Star Wars and the Avengers, so that's most of them. So that's a big influence. But I would say that film studies scholars are reticent to study them because they're not high art, and some film studies scholars are reticent to study them for that reason. I think that another reason that studying superhero movies presents a challenge is because they're super different than they were in 1978. So this would be just an example. Superman, it's a 2-hour film, hour and a half film that you watch and then you're done. And then you might watch, another installment in a few years, but that's how we're taught to do film studies as scholars, is you sit in the theater for 2 hours and you watch a thing and it's discrete and it's over and you're done. But superhero movies are of an entirely different order now. So this is just a poster for the Justice League universe in general, and you can see that's Wonder Woman, Superman's not on here, but he's included, Batman, The Flash, Aquaman. And so there's a bunch of movies that all take place in the same universe and feed each other that are released over a series of years. But I'm sorry, this isn't displaying very well, but that's okay. I'll read through it anyway. But I would also say that, in addition to these movies, there's television shows, there's all these other offshoots. And to really get the full story that the universe is telling, you kind of have to invest in all of them. So a transmedia franchise or transmedia storytelling, like what that is, it's a narrative that unfolds across multiple platforms. So it's different than an adaptation, which is telling the same story with a few differences, right, between two media. But to get the Avengers, you kind of have to watch, or at least know a little bit about Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. It helps if you watch all of the movies. That's why it's a transmedia franchise, and it's facilitated by a lot of things, but one of them is conglomeration. So to go back to the Superman example, Warner Media, Time Warner, used to be, owns all of the DC Comics universe. And because there's multiple little baby companies under this big umbrella conglomerate, it means that that storytelling can take place in a newly synergistic way. So there's the movies like Wonder Woman, but there's also these CW shows like The Flash, Arrow, and Supergirl, that although Wonder Woman never shows up in the television show, and actually a different character plays The Flash in the movie, will play a different character, it's a big deal when that happened. They refer to each other all the time, and they take place in a synergistic way, and that's possible because they're all owned by one big conglomerate. So it's a new phenomenon, but I think that it presents a lot of anxiety studying these transmedia franchises, and so even if it's not about this isn't real art, superhero movies, and those are dumb, I think it actually presents a lot of anxiety to film study scholars because it's not the way that we're taught to study film. To study a transmedia franchise, we have to use new evaluation criteria because we're not just looking at one 2-hour thing. We're looking at how that 2-hour thing relates to other things that are going on. We have to, and the expense for us really is a time investment, and that you have to know a lot of different media well, and they're, it's akin to knowing newspapers and books really well. Those are two totally different industries, contexts, whatever. You might have to know to study The Matrix, for instance, which is another transmedia franchise, you kind of have to know video gaming a bit, you have to know something about comics, you have to know film, and like, we're not taught to do that. And you want to do it responsibly if you're going to invest in those other disciplines. So I think a lot of teachers stay away from them. I think also there's an anxiety for students, it seems, about studying this stuff, that I think that a lot of them watch these, and I assume that, you know, thinking about them as digital natives, as Jade said, I think of them that way. But not every student writes fan fiction or is invested deeply in like fan cultures and Reddit and things like that. And so I think there's an anxiety about that. I think also in a transmedia franchise course that I'm thinking about, it's going to involve like a little bit of hands-on creation. And for studies students, I think similarly to English students who do creative writing, like that's a whole different ball of wax and can be really scary. And create a lot of anxiety. And a lot of the tools that we might use to study transmedia franchises cost money. And I don't want to put that on them. I don't think that's fair. And you know, I don't want to put that on my institution necessarily either. So one of the ways that I've thought about this is using really low-tech digital humanities tools to get stuff done and to help students think about transmedia franchises without that new technology anxiety, or to lessen that as much as possible. So in my Intro to Film Studies course, that involves storyboarding, that they have a choice of whether they want to do it sort of drawn storyboards, or they can use digital technologies to do that. And it's something that the storyboarding idea is something I'd like to carry over into this Transmedia Franchises course that I'm going to talk about, that I'm going to teach next spring. So I want to spend the rest of my time thinking about that. So thinking about one like unit or low stakes assignment and how that might feed a final assignment. Because I think that digital humanities can help students understand a really important idea when you're talking about transmedia franchises, and that's to what extent are transmedia franchises a mode of content, and to what extent are transmedia franchises a mode of marketing. So when I explain this to my students, I tell it to them in Star Wars, so that's what I'm going to do for you. So in what way is it a mode of marketing? Well, transmedia franchises, if we're thinking super cynically, are about getting butts in seats in theaters and getting people to spend money and on that franchise. And so Star Wars is a progenitor of this, that when the movie came out, George Lucas admitted that he started thinking about toys. He started thinking about his filmmaking in terms of toys, hence Ewoks, if you've seen Return of the Jedi. And so that kind of merchandising where those toys, he had a really good relationship with Kenner, which is a toy-making company, were released synergistically to keep people interested in the franchise in between films, to allow younger people to participate, even if they were too young to see the movies, they're allowed to see the movies. That's all made possible by conglomeration. And those playing with those toys and getting to tell your own stories with those toys, or playing the video games later, going to McDonald's and getting a Happy Meal with the toys in them, was all a way for people to participate in the franchise. That's made possible by conglomeration, and that effort is a storytelling effort in which people participate. But it's also a mode of content, and so, if you have any Star Wars fans in your life, you know that the devotion to the story can be very real and very deep. And I am among them, so I say that with no judgment. That you kind of have to, if you really want to call yourself a Star Wars fan, like you have to watch the Clone Wars series. You have to know something about the novels. And all of them are kind of telling a story with fans participating as authors. Sometimes the fans can actually change how a story unfolds. And I want my students who are participating that way to think about that effort. So this assignment I'm going to explain is designed to kind of help them do that. So I think, are we a little short on time? Okay, so I won't show you this, I'll just describe it. But basically there's a film that I usually show that describes a marketing effort around The Dark Knight, the Batman film The Dark Knight, which was basically a really elaborate, beautifully sophisticated scavenger hunt where it was a top-down effort. In other words, the studio released this, used a PR company to release this series of tasks that viewers could do if they wanted to get little Easter eggs into the film, if you sort of completed all of the tasks, and which involved like doing some guerrilla marketing for them, because you had to post them online and hashtag them and stuff, that you could see the first 5 minutes of the film. And so that's really a mode of marketing. It's getting your viewers to do some marketing for you, getting them to have a different kind of ownership than I know that I had when I saw the first Star Wars movie and didn't feel like I was really a part of that. I was just passively receiving it. This changes people's activity into kind of more active. So one assignment that I'm considering doing is this scavenger hunt geocaching experience to help the students think about that. But I'm going to skip through that a little bit so that I can talk a little bit more about transmedia franchising as a mode of content. I think that a lot of students are interested in kind of making these transmedia franchises or participating in some way. And, you know, if you're telling a story across 10 years and across all these different platforms, like, how do you do that? Like, who teaches you how to do that? I'm not a production person, so that's not me. But I do think that we can study existing properties to learn what they're doing. So one of the ones that I'm considering teaching is a film called Bandersnatch, which is a part of the Black Mirror franchise on Netflix. It's not a transmedia storytelling effort, but it's super interactive, and I think that it engages a lot of the things, a lot of the questions that transmedia studies narratives ask of us. So what makes it so interactive, if you've played this before, if you've watched it, it's a choose your own adventure film. So every so often in the film, the film will kind of stop, and you'll have the choice as a viewer whether basically you want the protagonist to like run from danger or towards it. And you get to choose. So there's this ethos, like if you remember reading those choose your own adventure books when you were little, this ethos of like free will, of like I am in control and I'm authoring this text and I can do anything I want. How do you plan such a complicated narrative? Well, Charlie Walker, who did plan this narrative, used this free open source software called Twine, which this is an example to the right there, which I'm considering using in an assignment because it's free and open source, so there's no barrier to entry in terms of cost, and you don't have to have any coding knowledge to do it, to use this online tool. Although if you know CSS, if you know how to code, you can enhance what you're doing, but you don't have to know. And so the way that Charlie Baker describes it is it's like a patchwork quilt that you can move the pieces around to design the sort of nonlinear storytelling effort the way you want. So one of the questions I'm just wrestling with right now is, do I want students to make their own to kind of get at how do you plan these complicated narratives, or will that get them too lost in that kind of instrumental thinking, or do I want them to study maybe even Baker's Twine, which I think I could find online. Study an existing project and learn about it that way. So that's the kind of low stakes assignment that I'm thinking about, because I'm going to skip through this, because Bandersnatch is a monumental storytelling effort. I want them to learn, or at least think about how those stories kind of get together and make sense, but it's also an elaborate data mining experiment. So Netflix is a private company. They don't have to share how they use our data, but every time you make a choice within Bandersnatch, Netflix learns about how you're making choices and how you decide what to watch and how you decide what you do, what do you want in a thing. And I would say, so this ethos of free will is sort of delimited. Your participation has some qualifiers that are like super important to think about, in part because these transmedia franchises often unfold online in this way. So there's like a kind of maxim that goes with studying these, which is if you're not paying, you are the product. So like Facebook would be an example of that. And so I want them to think about those implications. And so just to wrap up, one of the things that I'm thinking about, and part of why I'm considering having them do Twine instead of just study it, is that for the final assignment, I'd like them to build their own transmedia extension. So it would be helpful if we had some practice with those earlier on. So whether that's the kind of scavenger hunt that I briefly described, or a storyboarded video game maybe, it could be a board game, it could be a social media profile. Hopefully it would be a place where they could demonstrate that they've thought not only about like the content piece, how does this contribute to the larger story world, but also what's the industrial incentive for making this? What's the marketing piece? So that's what I'm thinking right now. And in the Q&A, I'm excited to hear if you have thoughts. Thank you.